are involved with conflict. So if you think about who are two of the greatest presidents in American history, it's Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And what do those two have in common? Well, they both were presidents during a great crisis in American history. All right, you have Franklin Roosevelt presiding over World War II and the Great Depression, and you have Abraham Lincoln presiding over the Civil War, okay? All right, so this is the big issue that James Monroe faces as the president. First of all, I want you to take a look at this map, and what is the first thing that comes to mind when you see this map? What's the first thing that comes to mind? What word describes this map to you? Somebody raise your hand and tell me what you see here. What comes to mind when you see this map? What do you think about? What do you see when you see this map? How would you describe it? Let's see here. Addie, what do you see when you see this map? How would you describe this map if you had to explain it to somebody?
That like more of the top territory is like free territory.
Yeah. Okay. So the larger area to the north of the, you're focusing on this area right here where it says unorganized. Unorganized basically means it's not been settled. The borders have not been established, and it's not really lived in. Okay. Yeah. This is largely free territory. And the key thing to look at this with this map, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is a very fractured country. It's a very divided country. You have the blue states in here in the north, which, and again, the reason why we're talking about north is because if you talk about your cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, the states to the north, these states are free states. You can see here on the key. States in the south are slave states. You also have free slave territory. And everybody asks me this question. I think it's a great question. I'm not certain why Arkansas originally had a W and then was switched to an S. All right? Because people always bring up the interesting point that we say Arkansas and it ends with an S, but we say Kansas, which also ends with an S, which is really interesting. It's really strange. Okay? But we are a nation that's divided over the issue of slavery. Okay? These states here in the north have been free, many of these for a very long time, or some of them came in as states automatically as free states. Like Indiana, for example, was always a free state. Why? Because this whole entire territory was always supposed to be free territory. Sorry, I'm trying to draw with my mouse here. This was always supposed to be free territory. So when it went from territory to states, it always was intended to be free, okay? That means slavery would not be allowed. But here's the problem. The issue comes down to one thing. When we start moving west, when we start moving in the direction west, and new territories added and then new states are added, there's a very big concern about keeping a balance of free states and slave states. And if you notice here on the dates, and if you go, we're going to avoid 1820 for a minute, we're going to go back. Notice how the states are added. 1816, we had Indiana. 1817, we had Mississippi. 1818, we have Illinois. 1819, we have Alabama. So that's 2 slave states, 2 free states that are added. That balances each other out. Now, why are we so concerned about that? Well, we're going to go back to something we talked about a little bit. I know Mr. Connerly also talked about this with you prior to last week, okay? Where do we make laws in the federal government? Which branch of government? Where do we make laws? Shaden, where do we make laws in the federal government? Which branch of government? So we have executive, legislative, or judicial. Which one of those 3 branches do we make laws? Let's see here. Tegan, which branch of the federal government do we make laws? Legislative, executive, or judicial?
Legislative.
That's correct. So legislative branch. And in the legislative branch, you have two parts. One is called the House of Representatives and one is called the Senate. Okay? And remember, in the House of Representatives, each state has a different number of representatives because it's based on population. And the state's population is all over the place. It changes constantly. Okay? But in the Senate, every state has 2 senators, no matter how big the state is. Okay? So for example, in 2020, California's population is about 33.4 million people. Wyoming's population is about 400,000 people. Okay? But yet each state has 2 senators. So here's why this is such a big issue. If you notice down here on this key, in 1821, after this whole crisis is over, we're going to have 12 slave states and 12 free states. But here's the problem. Up until 1820, we had an even number of slave states and free states. We had 11 slave states, 11 free states. And the reason why that balance is so important is because in the Senate, if you have a lopsided advantage, meaning let's say, we're going to say hypothetically, all right? Let's say that in 1818 or 1819, let's say we add another state, we add a slave state. And so now we have 12 slave states and 11 free states. That's 2 extra votes for the group of slave states. They can use those 2 extra votes to have an advantage when it comes to voting on laws that have an impact on slavery. And so because we have free states and we have slave states, we have 2 different groups that have 2 different viewpoints on slavery. Those who don't want slavery and those who do, okay? And so the reason why this is such an issue is that if you have an imbalance in the number of slave states and free states, there's always going to be an advantage. And that advantage could be used to create a law that benefits whichever side has that advantage. So when Missouri asked to be a state, that would give the slave states an advantage of 12 to 11. And that 2 extra votes causes a major crisis because the country, from this point moving forward, this map says 1821, for the next 40 years up to the Civil War, we are in a crisis because part of the country wants to see slavery continue, part of the country does not. All right? And it's really impossible to be a country that exists where half of it believes this and half of it believes this on something as controversial as slavery. Okay. And so when Missouri wants to become a state, what they do is it's called application for statehood. Statehood means a territory becomes a state. So like up here in Michigan, the Michigan Territory. Well, this is part of Michigan. There's the lower peninsula, there's the upper peninsula. Michigan's a territory. When it becomes a state, it's going to do the same thing. All right. One of the things that you had to have in your state, in your area to become a state is you had to have 60,000 people. 60,000 people. All right. So Missouri applies for that. And Missouri says, we as a territory would like to apply as a state and we want to be a slave state, meaning the people that live in Missouri the majority of them are slave owners and they want to see their state be a slave state. Okay. And so when they apply for statehood as a slave state, that becomes a concern for all these free states in the North that already exist because that's going to give the slave states an advantage in the Senate when they vote. And so there's a crisis here. All right. There's a big part of this. Part of the reason this is a huge crisis, folks, is because one of the big themes is if you're a slave owner, you believe that you have the right to take your property anywhere you want. So if you live in Georgia and you want to move to Missouri, you have the right to take your property from Georgia to Missouri. Okay? And so that makes this a whole bigger issue that is something we have to focus on because the concern here is that how are we going to how are we going to tell, the country's trying to figure out a way to solve this crisis because of this new state, but it also knows that there's going to be an issue with slave owners who are going to be upset because they can't take their property where they want. So we have a crisis here. One group wants this, one group wants this. And when you have two groups that can't agree on something, you have to try to find a middle ground, which is compromise. So what they ended up, whoops, sorry. Hit my button. Oh boy, I lost it. Sorry about that. Okay, so what they do with Missouri is they add the state of Maine. Now, Maine had originally been a part of Massachusetts, but the federal government was able to convince Massachusetts to give up control of this territory so it would become a state. Now, there were a lot of people living in the Maine territory, much more than Missouri. So if you go back to, that electoral map that I showed you before, this, the 1820 map, there's a lot more people in Maine than there are in Missouri. But look what this does. If you add these in as a pair, then you keep this balance of 12 and 12, this even number, 12 slave states, 12 free states. And so the goal moving forward is that this number remains constant. In other words, it remains an equal number. I shouldn't say constant, it remains equal, because we do know that one thing that will continue to happen is the country is going to grow in size. We're going to continue to push west. We're going to continue to add new territory. The population is going to continue to grow. That's going to happen. All right. But here's the thing. This balance is not going to be able to stay the same forever. We are going to get to a point where these numbers are not going to stay the same. And that's going to cause a bigger issue, because what ultimately is going to lead to the Civil War is this. States that have slavery are going to be convinced that the federal government is going to take away their right to their property. And instead of staying in a country that protects their property, they're going to get, they're going to feel threatened and leave that country to create their own. That's what ultimately comes down to the Civil War. Is it's a concern over the states, these states in the South, and more, like Texas will be there, Arkansas will be there. I know I'm drawing all over this, but I'm trying to give you a visual for this. When all this area feels threatened that the federal government's going to take away their right to property and slavery, then they're going to say they've had enough and they're going to leave the country, which is called seceding or secession. Okay, that's what it's going to come down to. But this is a crisis that thankfully is solved in 1820 by a compromise. And ironically, this compromise is going to last for a while until we have another issue involving a balance of slave states and free states that threatens the Union once again. Okay. Is there any questions that anybody has at this time? All right. So what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to go ahead and activate the exit ticket so that you can get that done. A reminder, I'm going to be sending a message. Please do not leave the meeting yet. I'm going to be sending a message out that's going to have the code, the access code for you to complete the quiz from Friday. Several of you have not completed that. That is an assessment grade that needs to be completed by the end of the day, preferably. That needs to be done so I can get those graded. All right, because those people who took it Friday, I want to make sure that theirs is graded. Okay. All right. So I'm going to be sending out a message to people with the access code if you have not taken the assessment yet. But you can go ahead and go to today's exit ticket. 2 main points of what we talked about with James Monroe's presidency and Missouri Compromise. So be fresh in your mind, because that's what I just ended up with, okay? All right, so you can go ahead and work on that. And again, I'm going to send out the Canvas message in just a minute with your access code. If you need to take that quiz, I'll give you instructions on where to access that as well. Granted, I did send this out on Friday, but I'll send it out again to you today. Have a good rest of your day. I will see you tomorrow at 8:05. Talk to you then.